In a small, close-knit town, a single act of prejudice at a local diner sets off an unexpected and transformative series of events. When the longtime owner denies service to a well-respected veteran, he believes he's simply following his own beliefs. But as the veteran walks out, hurt and humiliated, the owner is unaware that this choice will ripple far beyond his café. Unknown to him, his actions have captured the attention of someone with the power and the determination to confront the town's long-standing biases. What unfolds next will challenge deeply held beliefs, bring the community face-to-face with its own prejudices, and ultimately lead to a powerful journey of forgiveness, redemption, and change. Get ready for a story that reveals how a single moment can inspire an entire community to rebuild and grow stronger together. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to join us for more powerful stories of inspiration and transformation. Bookmark. Joshua Lee let out a heavy sigh as he climbed out of his old pickup truck, feeling every ache in his worn-out joints. Years of hard work and military service had left their marks, and the toll showed in the stiffness of his movements. Squinting up at the old sign above Mike's Café, a small smile spread across his face. He'd been coming here for years, drawn by the familiar faces and comforting food in this small southern town he called home. The afternoon sun was warm, casting a glow over the little diner that had become a regular spot for him. With the creak of the door, he stepped inside, the jingle of bells overhead welcoming him in. The rich aroma of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, making his stomach rumble. He nodded in greeting to the usual crowd and made his way to the counter, sliding onto his favorite stool with a sense of ease. But today felt different. The usual buzz of conversation seemed to hush as he entered. Joshua glanced around, sensing the weight of silent stares fixed on him. He brushed it off at first. Old habits from his military days reminded him not to let paranoia get to him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As Joshua settled at the counter, the owner, Mike Harlan, emerged from the kitchen. Mike, who usually wore a welcoming smile, approached with a hardened expression, his eyes cold and distant. Joshua shifted uncomfortably under the gaze, a pang of unease stirring within him. "What can I get you today, Josh?" Mike's voice was sharp, missing its usual warmth. Joshua chose to ignore the strange mood, hoping a bit of friendliness might break the tension. "Just the usual, Mike, a hot cup of coffee and a slice of your famous apple pie." He offered a gentle smile, as he always did, but Mike's expression only hardened, his jaw clenched tightly. "Sorry, Joshua, we're all out of pie today." Joshua's brow furrowed in confusion. He could clearly see a fresh apple pie cooling just a few feet away. "But, Mike, it's right there." "I said we're out," Mike snapped, his tone rising as he gripped the counter, knuckles turning white. Joshua's face fell, the joy of his regular visit replaced by a heavy sense of disbelief. The other patrons looked away, some whispering amongst themselves, uncomfortable with the exchange. After years of friendship with Mike, he could hardly believe what he was hearing. "I don't understand, Mike," Joshua said softly, his voice laced with pain. "Did I do something wrong?" The sneer on Mike's face twisted deeper. "Wrong? You did plenty wrong just by showing up here. I don't serve your kind in my establishment. Now get out before I call the police." The words struck Joshua like a physical blow. Stunned, he stumbled back, the familiar warmth of the cafe now replaced by a chilling hostility. This wasn't just anyone. This was Mike, a man he'd thought was a friend. The small, supportive community he'd once felt in this cafe suddenly felt distant, unwelcoming. Struggling to hold on to his composure, Joshua turned and headed toward the door, his steps heavy with disbelief and sorrow. Just as he reached the exit, a young woman at a nearby table shot to her feet, her voice trembling with anger. "This isn't right," she called out. "You can't treat him like this, Mike." Mike rounded on her, his face flushed with anger. "This is my cafe, and I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The woman hesitated, torn between standing up for what was right and fearing the consequences of defying Mike. In the end, her courage faltered, and she sat down, eyes cast in shame as Joshua shuffled out of the cafe alone. As the door closed behind him, the quiet cafe erupted into whispers. Some patrons paid their bills quickly, leaving in a hurry, unwilling to support Mike's actions. Others stayed, either too stunned to move or quietly approving of what they had witnessed. Little did Mike know, the decision he'd made that day would soon ripple through the entire town, shaking it to its core. And if he'd known who Joshua really was, he might have thought twice about his behavior. Joshua was not just a veteran, he was the father of one of the most influential leaders in the country. The pain and prejudice he faced that day would set off a chain of events that would bring long-buried tensions to the surface, forcing the town to confront its own hidden biases. Joshua returned to his truck, his mind swirling with emotions. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, feeling the familiar warmth of the sun mock him as it highlighted the harsh reality of what he'd just experienced. The hurt and humiliation washed over him, memories of past injustices bubbling to the surface. But as he sat there, the pain began to transform, replaced by a fierce determination. Joshua was many things: a father, a decorated soldier, and a deeply respected member of the community. He was not a man who let injustice go unanswered. Taking a steadying breath, he turned the key in the ignition, his mind already formulating a plan. This was far from over. And in the small diner he left behind, Mike's sense of satisfaction began to wane as customers continued to leave, some throwing disapproving glares in his direction. He had followed the values he believed were right, instilled by his father, Restauqarant, but a gnawing feeling of unease grew in the pit of his stomach as he locked up for the day. As word of the incident spread like wildfire through the town, people gathered in small groups on street corners and porches, discussing what had happened. Joshua Lee wasn't just another patron, he was a respected figure in the community, and many were shocked by the blatant prejudice he'd been subjected to. But when Joshua's son, Michael, a well-known U.S. senator and fierce advocate for civil rights, heard about what had happened, he felt an anger he hadn't felt in years. This was his father, a man who had fought to protect his country, a man who'd only ever asked for respect in return. Joshua had been wronged, and Michael was not going to let this go unanswered. The next steps would be bold, and this small act of bigotry would become the catalyst for an upheaval no one in town could have anticipated. The evening after the incident, Joshua sat in his modest living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of his home. He glanced at a framed photo of his wife Susan, who had passed away years ago. She'd always been his source of strength, her presence a steady reminder to stay grounded. Now, as he looked into her eyes in the photograph, he felt the injustice of the day's events weigh heavier. Just as he settled into his chair, his phone buzzed, breaking the silence. When he saw the caller ID, he sighed, bracing himself for the conversation he knew was coming. It was his son, Michael. "Hey, Dad." Michael's voice was calm but tense, laced with an undercurrent of barely controlled anger. "I just heard what happened." Joshua felt a pang of embarrassment mixed with relief. "Michael, I don't want you getting all riled up over this. It's just the way things are sometimes." "No, Dad," Michael interrupted, his tone unyielding. "It's not just the way things are. This is the 21st century. No one should have to go through what you did, especially not someone who's given as much as you have." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I won't let this go." Joshua knew that once his son set his mind on something, there was little anyone could do to change it. Michael was as strong-willed as his mother had been, a fighter with an unbreakable sense of justice. As a U.S. Senator, Michael had fought tirelessly for civil rights and veterans' issues. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man he was sworn to protect, the man who had instilled those values in him, was now a victim of the same discrimination he spent his career fighting against. "All right, Michael," Joshua said softly. "I won't tell you to let it go, but I don't want things to get ugly either. This town, it's all I know." "Ugly?" Michael's voice softened. "Dad, this isn't about causing trouble. This is about holding people accountable. The world can only change if we stand up against things like this." With that, Michael ended the call, leaving Joshua alone with his thoughts. Joshua took a deep breath, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his heart. But he found comfort in knowing his son was on his side. The following morning, Mike arrived at his café earlier than usual, his mood clouded by an unsettling sense of regret. Despite the previous day's events, he was convinced he'd done the right thing, upholding the values he'd been raised with. Yet, the usual hum of contentment that greeted him in his diner was absent. Instead, he was met with awkward silences and sidelong glances from patrons. A few hours into his shift, just as he was beginning to relax, he noticed a small group of protesters gathering outside. They held signs reading things like, "Equality for all," and "Say no to discrimination." Mike's face flushed with anger, his grip on the coffee pot tightening as he watched them through the window. Just then, the bell above the cafe's door jingled, and in walked a man he didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, and with an air of authority, the stranger scanned the diner with piercing eyes before focusing on Mike. "Are you Mike Harlan?" the man asked, his voice firm yet calm. Mike nodded, feeling a flicker of unease. "Who's asking?" The stranger's eyes hardened. "I'm Michael Lee, Joshua Lee's son." Mike's breath hitched and his face drained of color. The rumors about Joshua's son had been just that to him. Rumors. He'd heard people talk about how Joshua had a son in politics, but he'd dismissed it as small-town gossip. Now, standing face to face with the reality, he felt a flicker of fear, though his pride and resentment kept it from showing. Mike cleared his throat, summoning what bravado he had left. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is my café, and I can refuse service to anyone I please." Michael's expression remained neutral, though a dangerous glint appeared in his eye. "Is that so? And on what grounds did you refuse service to my father, a decorated veteran and a man who has lived in this town longer than you've been alive?" Mike's face reddened, his hands clenched at his sides. "Your father? People like him aren't welcome here. End of story." A hush fell over the café as patrons watched, horrified and fascinated by the exchange. Michael's jaw clenched, his voice barely above a whisper, but his words cut with steely resolve. "I came here to speak with you reasonably, Mr. Harlan," Michael began, his tone icy. "But I see now that approach won't work. Let me be very clear. What you did to my father yesterday wasn't just morally wrong. It was illegal, and I intend to use every resource at my disposal to ensure you face the consequences." For a moment, Mike's bravado faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself silenced by the quiet fury radiating from Michael. He hadn't just offended an elderly man. He'd wronged a father whose son had both the power and the determination to bring him to justice. Michael leaned in closer, his voice calm but deadly serious. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Mr. Harlan. I am not just Joshua Lee's son. I am a U.S. Senator, and I have dedicated my career to fighting the kind of bigotry you displayed yesterday." Mike felt his heart sink, the full weight of Michael's words sinking in. He had crossed the line, and he knew it. "This isn't over," Michael warned, turning to leave. "You'll be hearing from me soon." As the door closed behind him, the café fell into a tense silence. Patrons looked away, some unable to meet Mike's gaze. Others shook their heads, disappointed by his actions. Whispers filled the room as Mike stood frozen in place, grappling with the enormity of what he'd done. Meanwhile, as Michael left the café, he wasted no time pulling out his phone and making calls. "It started," he said to a colleague on the other end. "He's as stubborn as I thought. Time to move forward with phase 2. Michael returned to his father's house that evening, where Joshua sat waiting on the front porch. The two embraced, their shared pain hanging heavily in the air. "How did it go?" Joshua asked quietly, glancing at his son. Michael's jaw tightened. "About as well as we expected. He's not going to change easily, Dad. But don't worry, we have a plan." Joshua nodded, feeling the strength in his son's resolve. Although he'd been shaken to his core by the incident, knowing Michael was standing by him helped fortify his own spirit. For the first time in days, a glimmer of hope flickered in Joshua's heart. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be backlash, painful memories resurfacing, and wounds to mend. But he also knew they had the power to make a real change, not just for themselves, but for a community long divided by prejudice. The day after Michael's confrontation with Mike, word of the encounter spread rapidly through the town. In small clusters on street corners and in grocery aisles, people spoke in hushed tones about what had happened. Joshua Lee was a familiar name, an honorable man who had served his country and had long been a respected figure in their small community. Now, even those who didn't know him personally were shaken by the injustice he'd faced. Across town, as evening fell, Joshua found himself lost in thought, memories surfacing in the quiet solitude of his living room. His mind drifted back to his days in the service, to long nights under foreign skies, to the camaraderie that had held them together despite the battles raging around them. And, inevitably, he thought about the price he had paid over the years, the scars, both visible and invisible, he carried to this day. The knock on the door broke his reverie. When he opened it, there stood Michael, his son's presence filling the doorway with a sense of strength and reassurance. Joshua offered a small smile, stepping aside to let him in. "Thought you might come by tonight," Joshua said, easing himself back into his chair. Michael took a seat across from him, the weight of the situation evident in his expression. "I wanted to check in on you, Dad," he said. "Yesterday couldn't have been easy." Joshua gave a weary nod, looking down at his hands. "It was like going back in time," he said softly. "It's been years since I've felt that kind of rejection, that blatant sense of being lesser." Michael leaned forward, his gaze intense but compassionate. "You don't deserve that, Dad. No one does." He paused, then added, "I've started making calls. This isn't over." Joshua's eyes met his son's, a flash of gratitude mixed with caution. "I know you're doing this because you care, Michael. But just remember that people don't change overnight. Sometimes it's hard to break free from what you were taught." Michael took a deep breath. "I understand, Dad, but this town needs to face its own history and make a choice. Either they embrace change, or they stay trapped in a cycle of hatred. And if I can help make that choice a little clearer, I'm going to." Joshua nodded slowly, pride swelling in his chest. Though he was a man of peace, he understood his son's fire. In Michael, he saw a reflection of the values he'd tried to instill, the resilience that had carried their family through hardships. And now, as father and son, they were bound not only by blood, but by a shared purpose, a desire to build something better for the generations that would follow. Meanwhile, back at Mike's café, the normally bustling business had slowed to a crawl. Word had spread quickly about what he'd done to Joshua, and customers now avoided the place, opting to eat elsewhere rather than support Mike's prejudiced actions. Mike tried to ignore the hollow feeling growing in his chest as he served a meager crowd. His staff worked quietly, avoiding eye contact, and his usual regulars gave him stiff nods, some barely even acknowledging his presence. The sting of rejection was foreign to him. He was used to being respected in this town, seen as a man of influence and upstanding values. When his longtime waitress, Lisa, approached him during a lull, he could feel her disappointment even before she spoke. She'd worked for him for nearly a decade, and her loyalty had never faltered, until now. "Mike," she started, her voice hesitant, "I need to talk to you about what happened with Mr. Lee." Mike's face darkened, and he braced himself. "Lisa, if you're about to tell me how to run my own place, save it." Lisa bit her lip, summoning the courage to speak up. "What you did, it wasn't right, Mike. Mr. Lee has been coming here for years. He's been nothing but kind to all of us." She hesitated, looking him in the eye. "People in town are upset. Some say they won't come back. I just thought, maybe you should apologize." Mike's jaw tightened, his pride flaring up in response. "It's my cafe, Lisa. I make the decisions here, not you, not anyone else." Lisa's face fell, and she nodded, her expression a mix of disappointment and sadness. "I understand," she murmured before stepping back, returning to her duties with a heavy heart. Mike watched her go, feeling an unfamiliar pang of guilt settle over him. As the day wore on, the cafe remained quieter than usual, and Mike had too much time to think. He tried to shake the nagging thoughts, the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at his conscience, but he couldn't escape it. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, upholding the values his father had drilled into him since childhood. But for the first time, he found himself questioning whether those values were worth holding on to. The image of Joshua's hurt face haunted him, the deep sadness that had lingered in the man's eyes as he was forced out of the cafe. Mike found himself asking questions he had long avoided, questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. Across town, Michael had convened a small group of community leaders and activists, sharing his vision for a plan that could bring about change in their town. Seated in a modest meeting hall, the group included a mix of people who had witnessed or heard about the incident. Their faces ranged from anger to sadness to cautious optimism as Michael laid out his proposal. "We have a chance here," Michael said, his voice steady and confident, "to create something positive out of what happened to my father. This isn't about vengeance or punishing Mike Harlan. It's about showing our town and ourselves that we can be better than this. We can turn that café, a place that's been a symbol of division, into something that unites us." A local pastor, Reverend Langston, nodded thoughtfully. "And what exactly do you propose, Senator?" Michael's face lit with determination. "We buy the café. If Mike refuses to change, then let's take this opportunity to create something new, something meaningful for everyone in this town. A place that stands for unity, respect, and hope." The room fell silent as people absorbed the weight of his words. An older woman, Clara, who had been active in the local civil rights chapter for decades, leaned forward, a glint of hope in her eyes. "If we do this," she said, "it could be a beacon, a place for people to come together." Michael nodded. "Exactly. We would create a cafe that's not just a place to eat, but a community hub. We'd call it something like the Unity Cafe or Veterans Table, a place where veterans and civilians, young and old, of all races, could come and feel welcome." As he spoke, the room filled with a sense of purpose. The group began discussing ideas, sharing suggestions, and making plans for the future. Slowly but surely, the spark of change that Michael had ignited started to grow into a flame of collective resolve. Joshua, who had been listening quietly in the back, felt a deep sense of pride watching his son lead the community with such strength and vision. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, but as he saw the faces of his neighbors, people who were once divided but now united by a common goal, he allowed himself to hope. In that small room, they had taken the first step toward healing the wounds that had festered in their town for far too long. And as the night wore on, a feeling of unity began to take hold, signaling a new beginning for Joshua, Michael, and everyone gathered there. Early the next morning, as the sun's first rays filtered through his bedroom window, Michael was already on the phone, putting his plan into motion. He had decided to approach the situation strategically, determined to address the prejudice that had hurt his father and, in doing so, make an impact on his hometown. He knew that taking Mike Harlan head-on would only spark more division, so he focused on creating a positive alternative instead. A call to an old friend from college who worked in community outreach soon became the foundation of his plan. Together, they mapped out steps to buy Mike's cafe and turn it into a new space dedicated to healing and community building. Michael called it the Veterans Table, in honor of his father and all those who had served, a place that would welcome everyone, regardless of their background. Later that day, Michael shared the news with his father, who sat quietly in his armchair, his gaze fixed thoughtfully on his son. "You really think this can work, Michael?" Joshua asked, his tone laced with a mix of hope and doubt. "You think people will come together for something like this?" Michael nodded, his voice steady and confident. "Yes, Dad. I believe it can make a difference. I think we can turn this around. People just need a reminder of what we're all capable of when we work together." Joshua exhaled deeply, the worry lines on his face softening. "Then let's do it. Let's give this town a reason to be proud again." Meanwhile, back at the cafe, Mike was feeling the effects of his actions more than he'd anticipated. Each day seemed slower than the last, and fewer regulars were showing up. The usually bustling lunch crowd had dwindled to a few silent patrons who barely acknowledged him as he moved from table to table. The familiar energy of his cafe was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet that left him alone with his own troubled thoughts. The waitress, Lisa, approached him cautiously as he wiped down tables during the afternoon lull. She had overheard customers talking about a plan Michael Lee was organizing. A plan that involved taking over the cafe. "Mike," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral, "have you heard what folks are saying? That Joshua's son, the senator? He's planning to buy this place and turn it into something new." Mike's hands froze mid-wipe, his jaw tightening. "They can try," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He couldn't deny the rising anxiety he felt about Michael's influence. Rumors of the senator's plan had reached him through various channels, and it was becoming harder to ignore the growing resentment and distrust from the town. Lisa looked at him, her expression torn between loyalty and honesty. "People are talking, Mike. Some of them are saying maybe it's time for a change." Mike shot her a glare, though he felt the sharp sting of her words. He didn't need a reminder of what he'd done. Every empty seat in the café already spoke volumes. But he wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The café had been his family's legacy, a constant he'd clung to for years, and the idea of giving it up felt like betrayal. "I don't need anyone telling me how to run this place, Lisa," he snapped, shoving the rag into his pocket and walking away. Yet, as he moved back behind the counter, a nagging voice in the back of his mind made him question his own stubbornness. As the plans for the veterans' table gained momentum, Michael reached out to more local community leaders, eager to expand his vision and get as many people involved as possible. His passion was contagious, and soon the project became a beacon of hope for many townspeople who had felt disconnected or overlooked. Reverend Langston, one of the town's most respected figures, stepped forward to support the initiative, offering his church as a temporary meeting space where people could come to discuss their ideas. Clara, the civil rights activist, took on an organizational role, gathering volunteers and arranging a fundraiser to help with the café's renovation costs. As the community united in preparation, Joshua watched in quiet admiration, a profound sense of pride filling his heart. Though he had faced pain and prejudice, he saw the strength of his town shining through as people rallied around a shared purpose. One evening, as Michael was wrapping up a planning session, he received a text message that made him pause. It was from a family friend who had connections to a local real estate attorney. They had just been informed that Mike might be willing to sell the café after all. The next morning, Michael didn't waste time. He immediately arranged a meeting with Mike, hoping to have a conversation that might finally bring resolution. When he arrived at the café, the place was empty, save for Mike behind the counter, who looked up as Michael walked in. Mike's expression hardened as he saw Michael approaching, but he didn't protest when Michael gestured to one of the corner booths, asking to speak privately. After a moment's silence, Michael spoke, his tone firm but calm. "Mr. Harlan, I understand that selling this place might not be easy for you. It's your family's legacy. I can respect that." Mike nodded stiffly, his face clouded with resentment. "If you understand that, then you know why I'm reluctant. This café, it's all I've got left of my father." Michael gave a thoughtful nod. "I get it. I do. But it doesn't have to end here. This café can mean something new, something positive, Mr. Harlan. Think of the legacy you'd be leaving, not one of exclusion, but of unity." Mike scoffed, though his expression wavered. "And just let you turn it into some veterans' café or community space, all to satisfy some grand vision?" Michael's gaze was steady, his voice softening. "Yes, but not just for us, for this entire community. I don't want to push you into anything, but I want you to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you but for the people around you. We can't pretend nothing happened here." Mike's face flushed with anger, but the fire quickly dimmed as the weight of Michael's words hit him. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze locked on the empty tables around them, each one a reminder of the toll his choices had taken. Finally he took a shaky breath, his voice low. "What do you want from me?" he asked, a note of defeat in his tone. Michael leaned forward, speaking with conviction. "I want you to consider letting go, Mr. Harlan. Let this place become a symbol of something better. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to offer a chance for something new, for everyone, including you." Mike stared at the counter, his hands clenching and unclenching. He had spent years trying to live up to his father's ideals, trying to be the man he thought he was supposed to be. But as he sat there, he felt an overwhelming sense of weariness. For the first time, he allowed himself to question whether he'd been holding on to the wrong things all along. After a heavy silence, Mike finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can change, Senator, but maybe it's time I tried." Michael nodded, his voice steady. "That's all anyone can ask, Mr. Harlan." Word of the impending change swept through town like wildfire. News of Mike's willingness to consider selling the café brought a mix of reactions. Some were thrilled at the prospect of a new community space, while others couldn't hide their shock. Mike Harlan had always been a fixture in the town, a symbol of both tradition and, for some, stubborn values. To think he might let go of his café left people in awe. Joshua could hardly believe it himself. That evening, he sat with his son on the front porch, watching his neighbors stop by to greet him, their faces filled with warmth and encouragement. The support was both heartening and surprising, a testament to the town's growing openness. "Do you think he'll actually go through with it?" Joshua asked Michael, a trace of doubt in his voice. Michael took a sip of his coffee, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I think he will, Dad. There's something about this that's bigger than him, bigger than any of us. Sometimes, even the most stubborn people know when it's time for change." Joshua nodded thoughtfully, allowing himself to hope. The idea of the Veterans Table was becoming more than just a café. It was a promise of new beginnings, a space where the community could come together, regardless of backgrounds or histories. As days turned into weeks, Michael and his team worked tirelessly to finalize the purchase of the café. Community leaders, local activists, and even a few high school students joined in the effort, hosting fundraisers and organizing events to build excitement for the transformation. Reverend Langston held a special sermon, calling for unity and understanding, while Clara organized a community forum where people could voice their hopes for the new space. The energy was infectious, and even those who had initially been skeptical found themselves caught up in the anticipation. But as positive as the response had been, some residents remained wary of the change. A handful of townsfolk grumbled about the loss of old values, claiming that the cafe's rebranding would erase their heritage. At a town hall meeting held to discuss the future of the Veterans Table, emotions ran high. People from every corner of town had gathered in the community center, the room buzzing with opinions and concerns. Michael took to the podium, ready to present the vision he and the community had developed. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his gaze steady and sincere as he looked out over the crowd. "I know this is a big change, and I want everyone to feel heard. This isn't just about what happened to my father. It's about all of us and about what this town can be if we work together." An elderly man in the front row, Mr. Davis, raised his hand and stood up, his voice filled with both hesitation and conviction. "Senator Lee," he began, "this town's been through a lot. People hold on to what they know because it's safe. Are you sure changing something like Mike's Café will do any good? People around here, we don't like change much." Michael nodded, acknowledging the concern. "Mr. Davis, I hear you. Change is hard, especially when it means letting go of something familiar. But I believe we're not losing anything by transforming this café. Instead, we're building something new, something that will make all of us proud. A place where we can celebrate everyone's stories, everyone's contributions." Several heads nodded in agreement, and as the murmurs died down, Clara, who had been seated near the back, raised her hand to speak. "With all due respect, Mr. Davis," Clara began, turning to the older man, "sometimes change is exactly what's needed. I've lived here my whole life too, and I know this town is better than the ugliness that happened that day. This cafe could be a place where we don't just talk about coming together, but where we actually do it." Her words stirred something in the crowd, and a few people clapped, signaling their agreement. Encouraged, Michael continued outlining the vision for the Veterans Table. A welcoming space for everyone, with a special emphasis on supporting veterans, bridging community divides, and hosting events that would bring people closer. As the meeting wrapped up, Joshua, who had been quietly watching from a corner of the room, felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and pride. He had seen his son take a painful incident and turn it into an opportunity to unite the town, showing both strength and compassion. With each step forward, Joshua felt as though a heavy weight was being lifted. Days later, Mike Harlan made the difficult decision official, signing the papers that finalized the sale of the café. Standing outside as Michael and the others took over, he felt an unsettling blend of relief and sorrow. His father's café had been his lifeline, his connection to a legacy he'd tried to honor, even if his ways had been flawed. As he turned to leave, Joshua approached him, his hand extended in a gesture of peace. Mike paused, his eyes narrowing slightly before he shook Joshua's hand, his grip firm. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Joshua," Mike admitted quietly, his tone tinged with regret. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand." Joshua gave him a nod, his expression gentle but resolute. "Mike, we all have things we're proud of and things we're not. It's what we do next that counts." For a moment, they stood in silence, two men who had once been neighbors and friends, and who now found themselves on the cusp of a new beginning. As renovation work began on the café, excitement rippled through the town. Volunteers of all ages gathered to help with painting, repairing, and redecorating. They transformed the once stale interior into a vibrant, inviting space. Photographs of veterans from all backgrounds lined the walls, and an inspiring mural depicting unity and solidarity became the café's focal point. Finally, after weeks of preparation, the veterans' table was ready to open. On the morning of the grand opening, a crowd gathered outside, eager to see the new space. A bright, hand-painted sign hung above the entrance, and balloons framed the doors, creating an atmosphere of celebration. Joshua, who had been named the honorary guest of the event, stood at the front with Michael by his side. They exchanged a glance, and Michael gave him a nod, encouraging his father to speak. With a deep breath, Joshua stepped forward, his voice carrying through the crowd. "Thank you, everyone, for being here," he began, his tone filled with emotion. "I've been coming to this café for years, and it's been part of my life for as long as I can remember. Today, though, it feels different. It feels like a place where all of us can feel welcome, a place where we can come together, share stories, and celebrate each other." As he spoke, his voice grew steadier, the strength of his conviction shining through. "This café isn't just for veterans or for some of us. It's for everyone. And I hope that from this day forward, it will stand as a reminder of the good that can come when we choose kindness over hate, understanding over division." The crowd erupted in applause, and Michael reached out to embrace his father, their shared pride palpable in the moment. One by one, people began to file inside, marveling at the transformation. The veterans' table was filled with warmth and a sense of belonging. Neighbors greeted one another, sharing laughs and memories, and the once divided town found itself united by a renewed sense of community. But there was one last surprise. As people explored the café, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. Mike Harlan. Dressed in a simple white chef's coat, he entered quietly, nodding to Michael and Joshua. He had accepted their invitation to work at the veterans' table, ready to start a new chapter of his own. As Mike moved toward the kitchen, preparing to serve the very community he had once pushed away, he felt a sense of humility wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, ready to embrace a legacy that celebrated unity rather than division. The days following the grand opening of the veterans' table were nothing short of remarkable. Word of the transformation had spread throughout the town, and soon the café was bustling with life once more. People of all backgrounds gathered within its walls, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. For the first time, the veterans' table felt like a true community hub, a place where differences melted away and connections were built around a shared sense of belonging. Joshua could hardly believe the change he was witnessing. Sitting by the window in his favorite booth, he sipped his coffee, taking in the lively scene around him. Families sat together, old friends reconnected, and new friendships blossomed. The air buzzed with an energy that hadn't been present in years, and he found himself smiling, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Mike Harlan worked in the kitchen, flipping pancakes and plating dishes with a quiet focus. The change in him was subtle, but it was there. A newfound humility and an eagerness to serve his community in a way he hadn't before. As he served customers, he was met with mixed reactions. Some looked at him with uncertainty, while others offered polite smiles, acknowledging the effort he was making. Each smile and each nod of encouragement helped him feel a little more at home in this new chapter of his life. One afternoon, as Mike cleared plates from a nearby table, a young boy approached him, his wide eyes curious. "Are you Mr. Harlan?" he asked, looking up at Mike with a mix of curiosity and awe. Mike bent down, his face softening. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "My grandpa said you helped make this place," He said you used to run it too. The boy's eyes sparkled with excitement. Is that true? Mike gave a small nod, surprised by the boy's interest. Yes, that's true. I used to run this cafe before we changed it to what you see now. The boy grinned, looking around the cafe with pride. It's awesome now. Thanks for making it so cool. Mike chuckled, a sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. Thank you, kid. That means a lot. As the boy ran off, Mike felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, he thought, his presence here would one day be seen as something positive. Around the cafe, Joshua and Michael moved about, greeting old friends and new faces alike. They made sure to check on everyone, listening to their stories and sharing in the joy that filled the room. For Michael, the veterans' table was a dream realized. He had hoped for change, but seeing it unfold firsthand was even more powerful than he'd anticipated. That evening, Michael met with Clara, Reverend Langston, and a few other key figures in the town to discuss upcoming plans for the cafe. Sitting around a large table, they brainstormed ideas for events and programs that could continue to foster unity. I was thinking, Clara began, we could start hosting monthly dinners for veterans and their families, a way to honor their service and bring people together. Reverend Langston nodded, and maybe we could offer support groups for veterans too. A lot of them face challenges once they're home, and a place like this could make all the difference. Michael listened, inspired by their ideas. I love it. Let's also consider events that bridge generational gaps and bring the youth and older generations together. We could have storytelling nights where veterans and seniors share their experiences with the younger generation. As they continued to discuss, the vision for the veterans' table grew more vibrant, each suggestion adding depth to what the cafe could offer. Michael made a list of action items, promising to reach out to local organizations for support. When the meeting wrapped up, Clara placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. You know, we owe you a lot for making this happen. You and Joshua turned something painful into something beautiful for all of us. Michael gave her a warm smile. Thank you, Clara. But this isn't just my doing. This place, this community, it's the result of everyone here wanting to make a change. I'm just grateful to be part of it. The first major event at the Veterans Table took place the following weekend, a Table of Stories night, where veterans, families, and community members gathered to share their experiences and learn from one another. The cafe was packed, with people sitting at tables and standing along the walls, eager to listen. Joshua kicked off the evening, standing at the front of the room with a microphone. His voice carried a quiet strength, filled with the weight of his experiences. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began. I served our country many years ago, and while I've shared a lot of laughs and memories in this town, I haven't often shared my story. Tonight, though, I feel it's time. He went on to recount tales from his years in service, the friendships he'd formed, the hardships he'd faced, and the memories he still carried with him. As he spoke, the room was silent, each person captivated by his words. He spoke of his love for his country, his struggles, and the pride he felt in being able to serve, no matter the challenges. When Joshua finished, the room erupted into applause, and several people approached him, shaking his hand and thanking him for his service. The sense of respect and appreciation was palpable, creating an atmosphere of unity that was deeply moving. As the evening continued, other veterans shared their stories, some filled with humor, others tinged with sorrow. The crowd listened intently, their understanding of the veterans' sacrifices deepening with each story told. The Veterans Table became more than just a cafe that night. It became a space where people could feel seen, heard, and valued. Over the next few months, the Veterans Table continued to grow, becoming a beloved part of the town. Regulars who had once been wary of the change now visited frequently, joining in on community events and helping spread the cafe's message of unity. The town, once marked by a quiet division, now found itself coming together in ways that no one had expected. Even Mike, who had once resisted the cafe's transformation, found himself embracing the new spirit of the Veterans Table. His interactions with the community became more genuine, and he took pride in the cafe's new mission. Gradually, he began to feel a sense of redemption, the weight of his past actions lifted by each act of service he performed. One evening, as he was closing up the cafe, Mike noticed a group of teenagers gathered outside. They wore smiles and exchanged high fives, their laughter filling the quiet night. Curious, he stepped outside. "Hey there," he called out. "What are you kids up to?" One of the teens, a tall boy with a broad grin, looked up. "Just hanging out, sir. We come here every weekend now. This place is awesome." Mike smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. "Glad to hear it. You're always welcome here." As the teens thanked him and left, Mike lingered outside, looking up at the sign above the veterans' table. At that moment, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that his decision to let go had been the right one. The café was no longer just a building. It was a place of belonging, a place where each person had a role in shaping the community. As he stepped back inside, preparing to lock up for the night, he felt a profound sense of pride, knowing that the veterans' table was now a true legacy of unity, kindness, and hope for future generations. As the months passed, the veterans' table continued to thrive, becoming a pillar of unity and understanding in the community. The café's journey from a place of exclusion to one of acceptance attracted attention not just locally, but from neighboring towns as well. What had started as a small café with a difficult past had transformed into a symbol of hope, welcoming people from all walks of life. For Joshua, each day spent in the café felt like a victory. From his usual spot by the window, he watched as strangers became friends, veterans shared stories with younger generations, and neighbors built connections they hadn't thought possible. Despite everything that had happened, he was grateful for the place the veterans' table had become. Mike Harlan, on the other hand, had embarked on his own journey of redemption. Though he continued working at the café as a cook, each interaction with customers was a reminder of the forgiveness he'd been granted. Some days were easier than others, but he showed up every morning, ready to do his part to make the café a place of kindness. One afternoon, as Mike cleaned up tables after a busy lunch shift, he saw Joshua sitting alone at his usual spot. Gathering his courage, Mike approached him, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "Joshua," he began, his voice quiet but steady, "would you mind if I joined you for a bit?" Joshua looked up, smiling warmly. "Of course, Mike, sit down." The two men sat together in comfortable silence, both watching the bustling café. After a few moments, Mike cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "I wanted to thank you," Mike said, his voice filled with sincerity, "for giving me a chance to make things right. I know what I did was wrong and I'll never be able to erase it, but working here and seeing the good this place brings has shown me a different way to live. I hope I can keep making a difference here." Joshua nodded, his gaze soft. "Mike, forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about learning from it, about choosing to move forward with compassion. You've worked hard to make things right, and I think everyone can see that." Mike looked down, his expression filled with emotion. "I didn't think I'd deserve forgiveness. I wasn't raised to believe in second chances, not like this. But seeing what this café has become, it gives me hope." Joshua reached across the table, placing a hand on Mike's shoulder. "We all deserve a chance to grow, Mike. The veterans' table is proof of that. You're part of what makes this place special." At that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, and the two men sat together, sharing a silent understanding that spoke more than words ever could. News of the café's transformation began to spread far beyond their small town. A documentary filmmaker who had heard of the veterans' table reached out, wanting to capture the story of forgiveness and reconciliation that had taken place. Soon, a small crew arrived, filming the daily life of the café and interviewing the people whose lives had been touched by it. The crew spent days capturing scenes of community members laughing, sharing meals, and connecting over stories. They interviewed Joshua, Michael, and Mike, each of whom shared their perspective on the events that had brought them together. In one poignant interview, Clara, a local civil rights activist who had supported the café's transformation, shared her thoughts. "The veterans' table isn't just a café. It's a reminder that we can find common ground, even when things seem broken. It's a place where people see each other as they truly are, beyond labels and differences." The filmmakers captured a particularly touching moment between Joshua and Mike, who had come to see each other as friends and allies on this journey. Their candid discussions about the power of forgiveness and the need for understanding became a focal point of the documentary, resonating with everyone who watched. The documentary aired nationwide, and the response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded in, with people from across the country inspired by the café's story. Many shared how they planned to create similar spaces in their own communities, determined to bring people together and bridge divides. With the influx of support, the Veterans Table received donations from individuals and organizations eager to help. Michael and Joshua used the funds to expand the café's reach, organizing monthly community dinners and veterans support events. They also began offering workshops for young people on empathy, diversity, and building a better future. In the weeks that followed, Michael took the opportunity to share the Veterans Table's story on a national stage. Invited to speak at a civil rights conference, he recounted the journey his family and his community had taken from hurt to healing. He shared how a single moment of prejudice had sparked a movement of unity, inspiring people to see each other's humanity. When Michael returned from the conference, the town welcomed him back with open arms, grateful for the impact he and his family had created. Joshua, who had once felt the pain of exclusion, now felt the warmth of acceptance as the town united around the values of the Veterans Table. One evening, as the sun cast a golden glow over the café, Joshua, Michael, and Mike gathered in the quiet of closing time. The last customers had left, and the familiar stillness settled over the Veterans Table, now a place filled with memories of transformation. Mike turned to the others, a hint of emotion in his voice. "I never thought I'd see the day where this café became something so beautiful. I owe that to both of you. Thank you for believing in me." Michael smiled, reaching over to shake Mike's hand. "We all had our parts to play, Mike. You took responsibility, and you showed this town what it means to change. That takes real courage." Joshua placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, his voice filled with warmth. "And you've shown everyone that it's never too late to be better. We're proud of you, Mike." The three men sat in comfortable silence, each of them reflecting on how far they'd come. The Veterans Table, once a simple café, had become a legacy of forgiveness, a place where people could grow, learn, and support one another. As they stood to leave, they looked back at the empty café, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had created something that would endure for generations. The following weeks at the Veterans Table were nothing short of extraordinary. The café had become a place that felt almost sacred, a refuge where people of all backgrounds gathered to share meals, exchange stories, and break down barriers. Every day brought new visitors, each curious about the café's story and eager to witness the legacy of forgiveness and unity firsthand. Word had spread even further since the release of the documentary, and the café was receiving attention from people across the country. Veterans, community leaders, and families made special trips to see the place that had sparked hope in so many. Local schools arranged field trips, bringing students to learn about the history and significance of the café. Joshua spent much of his time warmly welcoming visitors, often surprised by the stories they shared. People came from all walks of life. Some had faced prejudice, and others were simply inspired to build stronger connections in their own communities. Many stayed to talk with Joshua, sharing how his journey and resilience had touched their hearts. One morning, a group of students from a nearby high school arrived, accompanied by their history teacher, Miss Ramos. She'd shown her students the documentary and had brought them to experience the café's atmosphere themselves. As they gathered around, Joshua took a seat at the front of the room, ready to answer their questions. A shy girl in the back raised her hand, and Joshua smiled, encouraging her to speak. "Mr. Lee," she began nervously, "I wanted to know how you were able to forgive after what happened. I don't think I'd be strong enough to do that." Joshua took a deep breath, his voice gentle. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once. It's a choice you make every day, sometimes moment by moment. For me, forgiveness was about letting go of the anger that would have held me back. It wasn't easy, but it allowed me to find peace and, eventually, a way forward for everyone." The girl nodded, visibly moved, and several other students leaned forward, hanging on his words. A boy in the front row raised his hand next. How did you feel when the cafe became the veterans' table? He asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Joshua's face softened as he thought back to the transformation. It felt like healing in a way. This place isn't just about coffee or food anymore. It's a reminder that no matter our pasts, we can build something good when we work together. The students clapped softly, inspired by his words, and Miss Ramos thanked Joshua for his time, expressing how much the visit meant to her and her students. As visitors came and went, Mike Harlan observed quietly from behind the counter. Though he'd become a familiar presence at the veterans' table, he still felt a sense of awe at how far the cafe had come. Watching Joshua speak with people who traveled from far and wide to hear his story reminded Mike of the power of forgiveness and the weight of the responsibility he bore. One evening, as Mike was closing up, Joshua approached him with a warm smile. "Busy day, huh?" Joshua said, nodding to the now empty tables. Mike chuckled, wiping his hands on his apron. "Busy, but good. Never thought I'd see the day where this place would be so full of life." Joshua nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's because of you, Mike. You chose to be part of the change. That's what keeps this place alive." Mike looked away, humbled. "I still feel like I have a lot to make up for," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm grateful to be here. Working at the veterans' table, it's helped me see things differently. People give me a chance, and I'm doing my best to earn it every day." Joshua placed a hand on Mike's shoulder. "We're all learning, Mike. None of us are perfect, but every day you show up and choose to do better. That's all anyone can ask for." They stood together in silence, the warmth of their friendship a quiet reassurance. The journey hadn't been easy, but it was clear that they had both grown, finding strength and purpose in their shared commitment to the veterans' table. As time went on, the veterans' table continued to evolve. With the funds from the documentary and ongoing donations, the cafe expanded its mission, hosting more events aimed at bridging generational and cultural divides. There were storytelling nights, veterans support groups, and workshops for young people on topics like empathy and community service. One particularly successful initiative was a mentorship program that paired local veterans with high school students. Together, they worked on projects that gave back to the community, from organizing food drives to helping with local cleanups. The mentorships became deeply meaningful for both the veterans and the students, fostering connections and a sense of purpose. Michael, who often visited from Washington, kept a close eye on the cafe's growth, lending his support to its initiatives whenever he could. The veterans' table had not only changed his father's life, but had also become a powerful influence on his own. The lessons of compassion, unity, and resilience shaped his work and strengthened his dedication to building a more just society. During one of his visits, Michael sat with Joshua and Mike, discussing new ideas for the cafe. As they brainstormed, they talked about the possibility of creating a scholarship fund for students interested in community work and social justice. "This cafe has done so much for us," Michael said, his voice full of pride. "Imagine what it could do for the next generation. If we can help these kids see the value of community, maybe they'll carry it with them for life." Joshua nodded, smiling. "That's a beautiful idea, Michael. Let's make it happen." One Saturday afternoon, the cafe hosted a special event called the Table of Remembrance, honoring veterans who had served and those who had passed on. People gathered to share stories of loved ones, bringing photos and mementos that adorned the tables in a beautiful tribute. The air was filled with a quiet reverence as people honored the memory of those who had sacrificed so much. Mike, who had helped organize the event, stood at the edge of the room, watching as families exchanged stories and memories. He was approached by an elderly woman, Mrs. Saunders, whose husband had served in the same unit as Joshua. "I want to thank you," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. "What you've done here, it's given us a place to remember them, to feel like they're still with us. It means more than you'll ever know." Mike swallowed hard, humbled by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Saunders. It's an honor to be part of this." She patted his arm, smiling gently. "You've come a long way, Mike, and I think they'd all be proud of what you've done here." As the event continued, Mike felt a deep sense of peace settles over him. The journey had been painful, and he had faced his mistakes head-on, But in doing so, he had found redemption and a newfound sense of purpose. The veterans' table had become a place not just for community, but for healing, and Mike felt a profound gratitude for the second chance he'd been given. Later that evening, as Joshua, Michael, and Mike sat together in the quiet of the closed café, they reflected on the journey they'd taken. The veterans' table had transformed from a symbol of division into a symbol of unity, a legacy that would continue to inspire others long after they were gone. Looking around at the empty tables, Joshua felt a deep contentment. "We've done something special here," he said softly. "Something that will last." Michael smiled, nodding. "It's only the beginning, Dad. What we've built here, people are going to carry it forward. They're going to create their own spaces, their own tables." Mike looked between the two men, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "for letting me be part of this. I never thought I'd find my place, but here I have." The three men sat together, united in a shared purpose and a deep understanding of what they had built together. As they locked up the café and stepped out into the cool night, they knew the veterans' table would stand as a beacon of hope, kindness, and redemption for generations to come. And as they walked down the quiet street, they couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something beautiful, a legacy of love and forgiveness that would forever be remembered. As the years passed, the veterans' table continued to flourish, not only as a café, but as a cornerstone of community life. People from all over the region came to visit, eager to see the place that had transformed from a symbol of division to one of unity and hope. The café hosted events regularly, from storytelling nights that brought young and old together, to veteran support sessions, to holiday dinners that welcomed anyone in need of a warm meal and companionship. Joshua felt a deep pride each time he saw new faces at the café, people from different backgrounds and generations, sitting together and building connections. The café had become more than he'd ever imagined, and its impact reached beyond the town's borders. One day, a letter arrived at the veterans' table. It was from a large national organization focused on community-building initiatives, and it contained an invitation to a conference where they wanted to recognize the veterans' table as a model of grassroots change. They had been inspired by the café's story and hoped to spotlight it as an example for other communities facing similar challenges. Michael read the letter aloud to Joshua and Mike as they sat together in the café after closing hours. The room was quiet as they absorbed the weight of the invitation, and each of them felt a sense of awe at how far they had come. "They want us to share our story," Michael said, looking between the two men. "They think what we've done here can inspire others to create their own spaces of healing and unity." Joshua leaned back, smiling softly. "This café has changed a lot of lives, including mine. If sharing our story means others might find the same peace, then I think we should do it." Mike, who had once resisted change with all his might, nodded, a look of determination in his eyes. "Count me in. I owe it to this place and to everyone who's been part of it." The conference was held in a bustling city far from their small town, and for many attendees, the veterans' table was a story they'd only read about or seen in the documentary. As Michael, Joshua, and Mike stepped onto the stage, the audience greeted them with warm applause, eager to hear their story in their own words. Michael began by describing the initial incident that had led to the café's transformation. He spoke about the pain of seeing his father humiliated, but also the strength that came from choosing forgiveness over resentment. He shared how a single moment of discrimination had become the catalyst for change, a chance to bring the community together in a way none of them had expected. Joshua took the microphone next, his voice steady and full of wisdom. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past," he told the audience, "but it does give us a way forward." The veterans' table became a place where we could all come together, not because we were the same, but because we chose to see each other as equals. As he spoke, the crowd listened in rapt silence, moved by the quiet power of his words. Some audience members wiped away tears, others nodded thoughtfully, reflecting on their own communities and the changes they wished to see. Finally, Mike stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. His voice was raw with emotion as he recounted his journey, the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons he'd learned. "I thought forgiveness was something that had to be earned," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I've come to realize that forgiveness is a gift. It's a chance to grow, to be better than I was." The veterans' table showed me that change is possible, even for someone like me. The applause that followed was thunderous, and as the three men left the stage, they were approached by people eager to thank them for sharing their stories. Many expressed how they, too, wanted to create spaces in their own towns where people could come together, heal old wounds, and find a sense of belonging. When they returned home, the news of their trip spread quickly, and the community welcomed them back with open arms. The recognition the veterans' table had received inspired new excitement in the town, and it wasn't long before the café was bustling with fresh energy. Community members took it upon themselves to organize events, volunteering their time and resources to expand the veterans' table's reach. In the following months, the café launched a series of new initiatives. They started an outreach program for local schools, inviting students to learn about the power of empathy and respect through workshops held at the veterans' table. Veterans who frequented the café volunteered as mentors, sharing their experiences and offering guidance to young people. The connection between the generations deepened, creating a sense of continuity and shared purpose. The café also began offering community dinners for the less fortunate, with meals donated by local farms and prepared by volunteers. People who might have felt alone or isolated found a sense of family within the veterans' table, and every gathering strengthened the bonds between community members. One evening, as Joshua was locking up the café, he turned to see Mike standing outside, watching the lights flicker off one by one. Mike stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the familiar sign above the door. "This place, it's become something bigger than any of us," Mike said, his voice full of wonder. "It's like the café has a life of its own now." Joshua nodded, a warm smile on his face. "It's because of everyone who believed in it, Mike. Every person who walked through these doors made it what it is today." They stood together in silence, reflecting on the journey they had taken, from the painful incident that had first divided them, to the transformation that had brought them together, and now to the legacy of hope that would carry on long after they were gone. As the years went by, the veterans' table continued to be a place of unity, healing, and hope. New faces came and went, but the spirit of the café remained the same. Generations of families made it a tradition to visit, and veterans from all over came to see the place that had been built in their honor. For Joshua, every day at the café was a reminder of how powerful forgiveness could be. He found joy in watching young people learn the lessons of compassion, just as he found comfort in the friendships he'd formed with fellow veterans and townsfolk alike. Michael, now a seasoned leader with a growing influence, often returned to the café, grounding himself in its simple warmth. The veterans' table had shaped him as much as he had shaped it, and he carried its lessons into his work, using its story to inspire others across the country. And for Mike, the veterans' table remained a place of redemption. Though he had started with a heart clouded by prejudice, he now found himself a different man, one who was respected, loved, and deeply grateful for the second chance he'd been given. One quiet evening, as they closed up for the night, Joshua, Michael, and Mike sat together, reflecting on the legacy they had built. They raised their coffee mugs in a silent toast, a gesture of gratitude for the journey they'd shared. As they stepped outside, locking up the café for the night, they looked back at the sign glowing warmly above the door. The veterans' table had become more than a café. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of community and the strength of forgiveness, a legacy they knew would live on in every person who walked through its doors. And as they walked into the quiet night, side by side, they knew their story was far from over. The veterans' table would carry on, its message of unity and compassion lighting the way for generations to come. Years passed, and the veterans' table continued to thrive, touching lives far beyond the small town where it all began. Generations of visitors passed through its doors, drawn by the café's legacy of compassion and unity. Its reputation as a place of healing and acceptance only grew, attracting not only locals but people from distant towns, each seeking the comfort and inspiration the veterans' table provided. For Joshua, time had brought a quiet satisfaction. He spent most mornings at the café, greeting familiar faces and new visitors alike. The journey from that painful day at Mike's café to the present had been long and often difficult, but seeing the café bustling with life, laughter, and friendship made it all worthwhile. One sunny morning, Michael walked into the café with his daughter, Sarah, who had just turned 16. Sarah had always loved visiting her grandfather at the café, but this time she seemed particularly excited. She looked around at the framed photos on the walls, the mural honoring veterans, and the tables filled with people from every walk of life, and she felt a sense of pride in the legacy her family had built. Michael caught Joshua's eye and waved, guiding Sarah over to her grandfather's table. Joshua's face lit up as he saw his son and granddaughter approaching, and he stood up to greet them with open arms. "Grandpa," Sarah said, beaming, "I've been looking forward to this all week. There's something I want to ask you about." Joshua chuckled, pulling out a chair for her. "Go on, then. What's on your mind?" Sarah's gaze turned serious, and she looked around the café with admiration. "I want to help here," she said, her voice earnest. "I know this place means so much to you, and I want to be part of it. I want to work here and learn what it means to build a place like this." Michael and Joshua exchanged a look, pride shining in both their eyes. Michael placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, nodding encouragingly. "That's a wonderful idea, Sarah," Joshua replied, his voice thick with emotion. "This place has always been about family and community, and having you here would mean the world to me." They spent the morning discussing her plans, Joshua sharing stories of the café's history and the values it represented. He spoke about the power of forgiveness, of the courage it took to change, and how the veterans' table had become a testament to what a community could accomplish together. True to her word, Sarah began working at the veterans' table, learning not only the skills of running a café, but also the deeper lessons it offered. She watched as veterans told stories to young children, neighbors shared meals, and strangers offered to help hands. She felt a responsibility to uphold the legacy her grandfather and father had built, and each day she worked harder, hoping to make them proud. One afternoon, as Sarah was wiping down tables, Mike walked over, carrying a tray of freshly made sandwiches. Now an elder in the community himself, Mike had spent years at the veterans' table, dedicating himself to its mission. He looked at Sarah with a gentle smile, pride in his eyes. "Your grandfather would be proud," Mike said, setting down the tray. "You know, he always said this place would mean something special to you one day." Sarah grinned, her eyes sparkling. "I feel like I'm part of something bigger here. It's more than just a café, isn't it?" Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's much more. This café gave me a second chance, and it taught me to see people in a new way. It reminds us all of what's possible when we come together." As she worked alongside Mike, Sarah realized the depth of the journey he had taken to find redemption, and she grew even more committed to carrying the torch of compassion forward. She often sought his guidance, listening to his reflections on life, forgiveness, and the importance of community. The veterans' table continued to serve as a hub for town events, celebrations, and gatherings. Each year, they held an anniversary celebration, where Joshua was invited to share his story with newcomers who hadn't yet heard of the café's origins. On one such anniversary, as a crowd gathered, Joshua stood at the front of the café, gazing out at the familiar and unfamiliar faces alike. "As many of you know," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "the veterans' table wasn't always the place you see today. It was born out of a moment of hurt, but it grew into a place of healing. This café has shown us all that when we choose kindness, understanding, and forgiveness, we can build something beautiful." He glanced over at Sarah, who was standing nearby, beaming with pride. "And now, I see the next generation stepping up, ready to carry this mission forward. It reminds me that this legacy will live on, long after we're gone." As the crowd applauded, Sarah felt a surge of pride and gratitude. She knew she had a responsibility to honor the values her family had upheld, and she vowed to keep the veterans' table thriving for years to come. Months later, Joshua decided it was time to step back and let Sarah take on more responsibility at the café. He had watched her grow into a compassionate young woman, filled with determination and a heart for service. Knowing that the veterans' table was in capable hands, he felt a sense of peace, ready to enjoy his remaining years with the knowledge that his family's legacy would continue. On Sarah's first official day as manager, Joshua arrived early to share breakfast with her. They sat by the window, where he could watch as the cafe filled up with regulars and new faces alike. "You know, Sarah," he said softly, "I always wondered what would become of this place after I was gone. Seeing you here, ready to lead, makes me realize that the veterans' table will be in good hands for a long, long time." Sarah reached over, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Grandpa. I promise I'll take good care of it." Years later, as Joshua watched from his porch, he would see young families entering the veterans' table, children laughing as they ran inside, and community members gathering to celebrate life's milestones. He felt a deep contentment, knowing that the cafe had become more than he'd ever imagined. One day, as he and Michael sat on the porch watching the sunset, Michael turned to him, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "Dad, you know, this cafe isn't just a place. It's a reminder of everything you stood for. It's a testament to the choices we made and to the power of forgiveness." Joshua nodded, smiling. "And it's a reminder that one act of kindness can change a whole community. I see it every day, in the people who come through those doors." They sat together in silence, both knowing that the cafe would outlast them, and that the veterans' table would be a beacon of unity, compassion, and hope for generations yet to come. As night fell, the lights from the veterans' table glowed warmly in the distance, casting a gentle light over the town, a light that would shine on, guiding the hearts of those who gathered within its walls, carrying forward a legacy of love, understanding, and resilience. The story of the veterans' table offers a powerful lesson on the transformative impact of forgiveness and unity. What began as a painful experience for Joshua ultimately became a beacon of hope for an entire community. Through perseverance and compassion, Joshua and his community turned a place once marked by prejudice into a hub of healing and acceptance. This cafe became a reminder that, no matter how difficult the past, people have the power to change, grow, and make amends. The biggest takeaway from this story is the strength of forgiveness. It shows us that choosing compassion over resentment can heal not only individuals, but entire communities. Through small acts of kindness, we can create a ripple effect that leaves a lasting, positive legacy for generations to come. If you found this story inspiring, comment 1. If it deeply moved you, comment 2. And please share your own stories with us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more powerful, uplifting stories ahead. Let us know your thoughts on the Veterans Table in the comments below.